Visit our sponsor, the Most Gifted Psychics. Call 866-228-2883 and mention code word HauntingLive to receive 10 minutes for just $10. 100% satisfaction guaranteed.
Canada is full of all kinds of wonderful lore. And I've just scratched the surface of it. I'm already fascinated. My name's Travis Watson, and you will find my books under the author name W.T. Watson on Amazon. So I always like to make that clear to people at the get-go.
Yeah, it's been great to have you on the show. Can you, first of all, introduce yourself to the audience and let them know who you are and just a brief description about what you do?
My interest in what I call the Fortean or high strangeness goes all the way back to childhood. My dad was actually a UFO witness. He had an encounter back in the 50s in the deserts of Southern California when he was in the Air Force. And he wasn't shy about telling the story either. He was one of those people who was like, "What do you mean you don't believe in UFOs? I saw a UFO." So that, and the fortuitous entry of a Ripley's Believe It or Not comic book on ghosts during that same time period got me started, and I've been a devotee of the Fortean ever since. When I was in 6th grade, I had already read Ivan Sanderson's book on the Abominable Snowman. I've been, fascinated with the topic for my entire life. And my life is now 62 years long, so I've had quite a bit of time to accumulate some knowledge. I actually started off writing. My first published work was actually a novel, which was based on the black dog apparitions that are common in the UK, Canada, the US, and South America. And my publisher I was talking to one day and said, "Gosh, you know an awful lot about this phantom black dog thing. You must have done a lot of research." And I was like, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Do you think you could write a book about that?" And that's how Phantom Black Dogs Walkers of the Liminal Way was born. Since that time, with Beyond the Fray, which is my publisher, I've also published a book called Mysteries in the Mist, which is about mist, fog and clouds and the paranormal, Canadian monsters and mysteries. When I moved up here, I started looking for the strangeness in my new territory, and quickly found out that Canada's got all sorts of interesting things, ranging from phantom ships to UFOs that we were talking about earlier. And my most recent work is Sasquatch Canada Beyond BC, which is all about the Sasquatch phenomena in Canada, in areas outside of British Columbia, because everybody thinks of British Columbia when they think of Sasquatch in Canada. So I am a collector of stories and love to read and research and talk about these topics.
So growing up then, you mentioned your father had some experiences. Did you have experiences yourself too in the family, or what happened to your own self when you were growing up?
Yeah, I did not have like any direct UFO experiences or hauntings or any of that sort of thing as a kid. I'm one of those people who I guess you'd call a late bloomer. As I got older, I began to explore more alternative spirituality. And as a result of that, have ended up having some really interesting experiences, ranging from many, many moons ago. I was, I guess you would say that most of my experiences are more in the area of synchronicity. I was interested in Native American lore at the time. And I was wondering kind of idly, I'd been reading about power animals and totem animals and all this thing. I wonder what my, power animal, totem animal, or whatever is. And suddenly I was inundated with wolves. It's like everywhere I went, I'd walk into a department store and there'd be a whole bank of television showing nature documentaries with wolves. I'd go to the dentist's office and there would be a magazine laying on the counter with a wolf on the cover. So I was like, okay, well, if this wolf thing is a thing for me, then I'd actually like to see a wolf. Now, at the time, I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, large urban area, right? A week later, I took a hike up Camelback Mountain, and I got to the top and I laid down. I actually dozed off for a minute, and I woke up to something panting in my face. And lo and behold, I'm staring into the face of a wolf. It actually was a wolf hybrid that was out for its walk with its person, but the owner was like, "Oh wait, that animal never approaches other people." It was basically sitting on me. I have, as I said, my spirituality ranges more toward the animistic. So I would say that I'm while I'm not a full-fledged medium, I'm sensitive to the presence of other beings around me sometimes, depending on the area. There's a nice little creek that runs over near where I live now. And when I'm out walking the dogs, for instance, I'm very cognizant of the fact that there are beings in that area that would very much like for me to start picking up litter. So, but those are my sorts of experience. I haven't actually ever seen a Sasquatch, for instance, although I rather suspect that we had them, in the woods of Western New York where I used to live. I had time periods when I lived out there where I definitely had that creepy feeling that people describe of being watched or, sounds in the forest. I had this strange thing where I would go through a period. I had a big bay window in the home where we used to live, and I'd go through a period about every fall and every spring where I had to have the curtains drawn at night. Any other time I was fine, but during that particular time period, I had to have those curtains drawn. No explanation for that. So yeah, I haven't had like the spectacular haunting, type things that some people have, or an encounter with Sasquatch or seen a UFO or any of that kind of stuff. But my world is a world full of spirits, and that's just that is my experience.
Yeah, we all start somewhere in this field, and I think your spirit guides and whatnot have your path set for you, right? So, like, if you haven't been in mediumship and you develop that over time, then that's the way you're meant to do that. So, your guides will guide you along on that as well. So, did some of your experiences growing up then cause you to start writing these down and have content for your book, or how did the content for the book start?
Actually, I'm one of those people. Okay, so let me back up into my childhood again. When I wasn't reading books about Sasquatch or whatever, I loved the books by Frank Edwards, who wrote Stranger Than Science, Strange World, a couple of other compendiums of the paranormal. You might compare him to somebody like Brad Steiger, okay, whose some of his books I've also read, who is a collector of stories. That's me. I'm a collector of stories. Whether it's somebody telling me a story, which I'm getting more of that starting to happen now as my name gets out there. Or, I find stories in newspapers, I find stories in books, I find stories online, I find stories wherever I can find them. And those are the things that make up my work. I did a lot for Sasquatch Canada. I did a lot of research in the sighting databases, um, as well as there's obviously many books about the Sasquatch subject. I have found, and one of the reasons that I wanted to write Sasquatch Canada was I had found that there were a lot of people writing about Sasquatch, and almost everybody was writing about Sasquatch in the United States. And if they mentioned Canada, it was typically going to be in British Columbia. Um, the only two sightings that I found that were fairly commonly mentioned outside of British Columbia were uh, a creature that they referred to as yellow top up in the Cobalt, Ontario area. And then there was a sighting. I cannot remember the name of that dam now, in Alberta that gets mentioned a lot. But you know, there are my research for this particular book. I'm pretty sure I have well over 200 what they call Class A sightings, visual sightings of a Sasquatch creature from Canada, and covering all the provinces of Canada. The only place I didn't find a visual sighting was Nunavut, but every other province in Canada has some visual sightings of these creatures. So, yeah, they're not just all hanging out in British Columbia. They're all throughout the wilderness. Whatever this thing is, it's all throughout the wilderness here in Canada.
I know you're located here in Ontario, so are we here in
Mhm.
Ontario. So how many of the bulk of the stories come from our neck of the woods here?
So there's actually a whole chapter in the book on. Well, okay, so there's the way the book is broken down. I have Sasquatch encounters from the various provinces. So there's a whole section of Ontario sightings, um, and they're very rich. I mean, there's a number of visual sightings of this creature in Ontario, particularly around Algonquin Park, and then up into northern Ontario. But you know, also into the urban areas. I have there's also a section in the book on roadside encounters because they're so frequent that I gave them their own section. There's a story from two truck drivers who were out on the QEW driving through St. Catharines, who claimed to have seen a Sasquatch down in one of the creek beds. So, yeah, and I spend a lot of time walking my dogs, in the area here, and you know, there are a lot of creek beds. There are a lot of waterways and stuff that interlace this area. Kitchener Waterloo area that we're sitting in, that are pathways for wildlife in the area. So, I mean, and I've heard from others that there are actually deer down in some of those creek beds. We know that Sasquatch seem to have a proclivity for hunting deer. So, who's to say? You know, of course, it could have been a case of misidentification, but you know, one of the things that I always say when people say, "Well, how could you possibly believe that there's a large unknown primate or some kind of creature or whatever Sasquatch is out in the woods?" I say, if you took the evidence, the visual sightings of this creature, and you took them into a court of law, the evidence is so overwhelming that you would have to be you would prove the existence of this creature. The only reason that people are unwilling to accept it now is that we have this hard shell scientific materialist viewpoint, that says that unless you bring me a body, I'm not going to believe it. And I don't know that that's ever going to happen because you've yeah, I mean, while we may have a flesh and blood unknown primate wandering around out in the woods in Canada, there's also some very strange events around these creatures that make you wonder if they're not something closer to what native people understand as being creatures that walk between the worlds, that have a physical presence when they're here, and then can retreat back into their own world, their own spiritual world when they want to. So there's a lot of mystery that surrounds the Sasquatch creature, and that's the thing that I really love about these topics is there are no easy answers. You can't just go out and take a picture of a Sasquatch or whatever and say, okay, we're done. There's always that, even if someone were to bring one of these creatures in, and it was scientifically proven to be an unknown primate and whatever, that still doesn't explain some of the stranger stories that we get. There's a section in the book that's called Strange Things. And in that, there are stories from witnesses who have seen these creatures just disappear. I mean, not fade into the forest, not camouflage themselves, just disappear right in front of them. There's the question of tracks too. Primates are supposed to have 5 toes, but we have any number of Bigfoot tracks that are 3-toed. So how does that happen, and why? It makes no sense from an evolutionary standpoint. So there's all kinds of strange things that surround the Sasquatch creature that are going to remain a mystery. And I think we need to have a love of that mystery and be able to abide in that mystery, to really enjoy and be a part of doing this work.
I think you're right there too, because this topic always seems to be at arm's reach, if you know what I mean. Like you find something, but then it's not quite reachable yet. You got to go that extra distance to kind of figure something else out about it, and it always draws you further and further. What's your personal belief on it? What's your personal side on what it is?
On Sasquatch,
Yes.
if I had to, if you're going to put a pin in me and make me come to a conclusion, because I mean, I talk about at the end of the book, there are any number of theories about what Sasquatch is, other than a flesh and blood primate creature that's living in the woods. But I think that we need to listen to the indigenous people, who have, I mean, I did not discover an indigenous group here in Canada or in the United States that didn't have a name for these creatures. And, many of them feel that the Sasquatch is a being of 2 worlds. When it's in the spiritual world, it's in the spiritual world. But it has the capability of walking into our world and taking on a physical form. So, I know that a lot of people will just roll their eyes and walk away from that kind of a viewpoint. But from an animistic viewpoint, it makes a lot of sense to me. Are there are beings, in the spiritual realm, that have that capability of being able to walk into our reality. And they're able, I mean, if you want to get into, aspects of physical mediumship, you can talk about being able to take on form from ectoplasm, for instance. If you want to take a more magical viewpoint, there's an etheric realm that, actually you're able to gather a physical substance from as well. And so, there are beings that are able to walk from one plane to the other and assume a physical form in this reality, and then walk back. And I mean, and a lot of people will say that, well, that's a matter of belief, and you believe that, and I don't believe that, and that's fine. Again, as I said, there are many, many different kinds of explanations, including, time anomalies. Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that, these creatures could come through some kind of a time anomaly, and this could actually be the Gigantopithecus blackie that everybody thinks it is, but it's coming from the past, and then it passes back into the past. That's as good an explanation as any, right? Greg and Dana Newkirk from of Hellier fame, actually have posited the idea that Bigfoot is a ghost of one of these creatures, right? So there's all kinds of explanations you could have, but I like the walking between the worlds thing. Um, because it seems elegant to me, that it explains the physical presence and of these creatures, and yet also explains why nobody can find one. And in fact, where you have these situations where people are surrounded by these, class B type phenomena, the wood knocks and all this stuff and rock throwing and everything, but nobody can ever seem to get one of these things on a thermal image or any of that kind of thing. If the creature's not entirely of this world, then there you go. But again, you know, as I said, I'm a both and thinker. And I don't have a problem believing that there could be an unknown primate out there as well. So
Yeah, no,
could
I,
be.
I agree with you on a lot of that stuff. It's like those points are well taken, I think, because it does explain a lot of things that we find in the field. Like, you can't catch them on camera. A lot of game cameras don't capture them, even when we
Mhm.
have thousands and thousands of game cameras out there. Footprints that just seem to end nowhere. Like, you'll see a trackway,
Mhm.
and it'll just stop in the middle of the field or something, and there'll be no footprints from a certain point. It's like, where did they go? So, a lot of things are unexplained still, and I think a lot more people are starting to become open to that idea.
Well, yeah, and you don't have to, throw your reason or rationale out the window. You just have to be able to expand your mind enough to think that, you know, scientific materialism doesn't explain everything. And so there are a number of different ways that this creature could be explained, and we just need to be open to the mystery of looking at all these different explanations, and that doesn't take anything away from the witnesses, because one of the things that I harp on in my books is the people who are seeing things are seeing things. They are having an experience, and it is real to them. And whether we're talking about an unknown primate, whether we're talking about a spiritual being, whether we're talking about something else, it's still real to them. It's very real to them, and sometimes very frightening to them, depending on their proximity to this creature. So, I think a lot of people are like, well, a lot of people have the feeling that, if they're not talking about an unknown primate or unknown hominid, that they're taking something away from witnesses. And I don't see that at all.
Yeah, that's true. Let's jump to some of the content that you do have in your book now. Can you talk about a couple stories that you like that you have in your book?
Oh, sure. There's the problem when you write a book like this is that there are so many stories that you liked that you have trouble picking a couple out. Probably my favorite from this book, though. A lot of people like to poo-poo Sasquatch witnesses as being, maybe uneducated, or just uneducated country folk or whatever. But one of the things that you find quickly when you start to read Sasquatch Canada is that the people that are seeing these critters are, I've got stories from police officers. I've got stories from people who work in the Forest Service, doing forestry work, who are out in the woods all the time. So all kinds of hunters, right, who spend a lot of time in the woods. But one of my favorites, um, which actually happened up near Wainwright, Alberta, is a story of a gentleman who's in the Canadian Forces. I was actually a special operations person with Canadian Armed Forces. This was back in the 80s, and he uh, and his partner had they were on a training exercise, and they were also electronics people. They did field repairs for equipment in the field. And they're off in their camouflage pickup truck driving along. They have their topographical map, and they're trying to find a piece of equipment that they're supposed to do repairs on. Um, and this was back before the days of GPS, of course. So, you got to get your map out and kind of do your thing and do your orienteering and try to figure out where these things are, right? They had stopped, and his partner had the map spread out on the hood of the car or the hood of the truck, and was looking and trying to figure out where this piece of equipment was. They were having some difficulty finding it. He's standing there. He's kind of relaxed. He's looking off at a utility. I think it was a utility line break. Um, just to clear space out there. Um, or maybe it was a fire break. It's probably a fire break. It was out in the woods. So he's looking and he sees a deer out there. He's like, oh, in addition to being a special operations person, he's also a hunter. So he's like, oh, look, deer. He's watching this deer. And as he's watching, the Sasquatch breaks cover on all fours in a flat charge, comes to 2 feet, grabs this deer, snaps its neck, throws it across its shoulder, and disappears back into the woods. And it happens so quickly that the guy doesn't even have time to look at to poke his partner and say, hey, look at that. And he likened that he had been in Africa and seen cheetahs chasing gazelle. And he likened the movement of this creature to a cheetah running down a gazelle. It was that fast. Now, when you're talking about, he says this thing was 7.5, 8 feet tall, built like a linebacker, like a football player, just huge, right? Says to imagine a creature of that size moving with that swiftness is just kind of awe-inspiring. And then when you take into account the witness that you're talking about, then I mean, this is not a guy who's easily shaken up. He's not a guy who's going to be like, oh, I saw a bear and I freaked out and thought it was a Sasquatch. This is a credible witnesses, credible witness, right? So I really, really like that story, because it puts all of the pieces together. You have this creature, it's hunting, and this is something that we see described a lot in Sasquatch encounters, and it's doing it's doing what you would expect a natural creature to do. So again, you can argue for the flesh and blood thing, but the really important part about that, like I said, is the witness. Because I mean, you can poo-poo a lot of people, but I don't think you want to argue with this guy. If he says he saw a Sasquatch, he saw a Sasquatch. Another one of my favorite stories from the book was it's actually I think it was a John Warm story, from Strange Creature Seldom Seen. So it would take place in Manitoba. Young girl, if I remember correctly, her name was Carrie. And she, and this is kind of one of the stranger stories, so kind of to balance things out. Not super strange, but little stranger. So, a young Indigenous girl, gone out to, and of course, as you know, a lot of Indigenous people still live in very primitive conditions here. And this was some time ago. I think it was 60s or 70s. One of her tasks was to go down to the local waterway and carry water back to the house. And she was carrying water back from the house, and it was berry season. You see berries pop up in Sasquatch stories a lot. So she decided that she was going to stop and pick some berries. And she made two mistakes. One is she ventured off the beaten path, and and she got turned around, and couldn't find where she had been. The second thing that she did is the second mistake that she made was that when she did this, she panicked and started to run. Now, I used to be a search and rescue volunteer, so it's like one of the things that we told kids and people anytime we got a chance was, if you find that you don't know where you are, stay put. If you possibly can. She did not. She ran and she ran and she ran and she ran, and she was, justifiably frightened because she was up in bear country, and the darkness, was coming on. And she was convinced that, her days were numbered. She eventually collapsed on a bed of moss and caught, a little sleep, but she got up and started moving again. And fortunately, she had the presence to stop and eat berries and so forth. So she managed to stay reasonably hydrated and so forth. But she was weakening, and she knew it. And she kept going, though. She kept moving. And I think it was her second night. She was laying down, and she heard something big moving in the brush. And she was like, "Oh boy, this is it. I'm done for." And this is a child of, uh, I want to say 11 or so, if I remember correctly. I'm done for, right? So, being a polite indigenous person, she told this bear, addressed it as grandfather and said, "Please, if you're going to eat me head first so we can get this over with." Yeah, but nothing came out of the darkness to eat her. But whatever this was kept getting closer and closer to her, until eventually she could reach out a hand and touch it. And she describes the fur as being like the pelt of a beaver, which I thought was interesting. But it was so, it's really, really dark in the woods, when you don't have, when you have a lot of overgrowth. It's really dark underneath. So she couldn't really see what it was that she was touching, until the sun started to come up and she realized that she was standing next to a Sasquatch, right? Oh, she's like, okay. So she started to run away, and the creature bumped her. And, she's, oh boy, this is it. It's going to eat me now, right? Um, so she kept moving, and she'd start to go one direction, and the creature would come up and bump her off in another direction. And this went on for, the whole day. The creature was just following along quietly behind her, and whenever she'd go off in one direction, it would bump her back in another direction. So it was keeping her going on a particular path, until eventually, as it's starting to, the day's starting to wind down again, she comes out on a road and recognizes where she is. So she, turns, she runs out into the road, of course, and she sees a truck coming, and recognizes one of her neighbors is coming down the road. She turns to see this creature, and it's gone. It's disappeared back into the woods. Well, she tells the older gentleman who picks her up, because of course the community's been frantic. They've been looking for her for days, right? Um, tells the older gentleman that a two-legged bear that walked upright, guided her out of the forest. And he just laughed and told her that that she was fortunate that she had run into this creature, and that it had protected her, and that it was a sacred thing. Because they very much view, Sasquatch and some of these other strange things in the forest as mysteries that, you don't really talk about, but everybody kind of acknowledges that they're there. The story has a happy ending. The older gentleman takes her back to her home. She's reunited with her parents. Everything is better. They don't really buy her story about the Sasquatch, or don't seem to, until later her father tells her that when he was a young man, he was lost in the forest, and a Sasquatch kept bringing him fish for him to survive until he could get out. So, so it must have run in the family. But anyway, are a couple of favorite stories that I had from the book, and like I said, the book is loaded with encounters from Alberta, at Manitoba, Ontario. Quebec is a little light on sightings, but then over into Atlantic Canada, there's plenty of Sasquatch for people to find out about, and really, the stories in the book are only a selection of some of the things that I found because I didn't want to keep repeating myself.
That's strange. I've heard of different stories out of Quebec. I thought there would be more from Quebec as well. So, but that's interesting. Great stories that you have in your book, and recommend that people check that out if they get a chance to, especially if they're local Ontarians or even throughout Canada. So, you mentioned before about a story from St. Catharines. Are there any more that you can recall that are more localized to Southern Ontario at all?
Not so much because obviously this is a very populated area, and the one thing that we know about the creature that some people call Bigfoot is that it tends to be, while on the one hand it's very curious about humans, or seems to be, it's also very elusive. And so that one stuck out in my mind because it was such an urban area. Um, most of the other, well, I would say all of the other stories really are in more rural parts of Ontario and the other provinces.
Yeah, such as Algonquin Park and stuff, right? So they're more in the northern
Yes.
areas.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's one thing I've always been curious. Like you just said, they are more known to be in wilderness areas or northern parts of the provinces and stuff. I wonder why they don't come into cities or city centers or like more populated areas. It's just because they're like other animals and they're scared of humans, or what could that be?
Well, okay, so let's go back to the physical animal versus spiritual creature dichotomy. Okay, on the one hand, uh, a physical animal, if a physical flesh and blood unknown primate slash hominid exists in the forests out there, it has managed to survive because it is extremely elusive. Um, it must be of above average intelligence. And there are people that claim that Sasquatch, for instance, is very careful about tracks and trying not to make tracks, unless it can't be avoided. Um, so, walking into a metropolitan area is going to increase the chance that these creatures are going to be seen. And I think that most wild animals recognize that humans are dangerous. And obviously we've proven that's true on many, many, many occasions. So ask the wolves about that. Humans are dangerous. So, from a wild animal standpoint, yes, I think it may be that if the flesh and blood side of this dichotomy, there is ample reason to avoid people. There may be curiosity about people, but there's also ample reason to avoid people, and so avoiding large concentrations of people is probably a good idea. If you go to the more spiritual side of things, native people are describing a creature that walks between the worlds. Um, in my mind, that instantly evokes images of the fairy folk from Celtic lore. Um, and if you know anything about the fairy folk of Celtic lore, you know that one of the things that they're known for is being allergic to cold iron. And there's an awful lot of iron and steel in major metropolitan areas. So could be that they're not wanting to come into major metropolitan areas because of that. Um, I mean, there's that possibility. It may just be that the energies in these areas are so frenetic that they don't, to them, I would think that a creature that lived a fairly solitary existence in the woods would be pretty sensitive. So it may be that they just simply find the energy of too many people in a small area to be too frenetic for their taste. That's just a couple of theories. Obviously I'm speculating wildly because nobody really knows. We
No.
haven't had a chance to ask a Sasquatch yet. If I can get one for an interview, I will definitely ask them that.
Yeah, for sure. It's like I think they have that energy focused in on the forest area as well, like that nature
Mm-hmm.
energy. I think that elemental energy is what they use as well. So I think that's probably why they stay in their territory. They don't come into ours too often. So, like you said, they're probably curious sometimes wondering what we're doing, but they don't come and see us that often. So,
Yeah, as you say, they do seem to be, creatures of the forest, and a lot of native traditions actually, view them as guardians of the forest. And actually, there are actually some folks that believe that the reason that Sasquatch is being seen more often these days is kind of a warning to us about what we're doing to the forest. So, there's that too.
wasn't that some of the encounters that people have is when they're doing things like mining operations or different things to the environment or they're harming the environment in some way, they tend to have the encounters?
I haven't found that to be necessarily true, but it is certainly the case that, well, for instance, one of the Sasquatch sightings in, I'm thinking it was Alberta. Um, I don't remember right off the top of my head. Was all a Bighorn Dam. So I think that's Alberta. Yeah, was all around the construction of a large dam. And there were numerous sightings in the area during the construction of that dam. So that may be true. A lot of the sightings that you see, though, are people who are out in the wilderness. They're out in their territory, basically. Hikers, hunters, like I said, forestry workers, soldiers, those kinds of folks that get out into the woods on a regular basis, are people that seem to be most likely to encounter these guys.
That's about all the questions I have for you today on your topics that you discussed in your book. But do you have anything else that you'd like to talk about quickly that's in your book or your other book?
Well, like I said, I moved to Canada in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. My spouse got a job at the University of Waterloo, and we did a cross-border international move in 1 month. So it was pretty stressful. But when I got here, I very much like I said, I wanted to explore, some of the strangeness stories that were up here, and that research got me into writing Canadian Monsters and Mysteries, which, like I said, is more of a compendium book. It has a lot of interesting stuff. Depending on what your area of the paranormal is, if you like ghosts, I didn't do too much in the way of hauntings, but there's phantom ships for sure. If you're a UFO person, there's pretty extensive sections on UFOs. And lake monsters, because have we got lake monsters? We got lake monsters everywhere, in just about every province, it seems. So, I think that the thing I want to put across is that, for people that are listening who, maybe haven't considered it, is Canada is full of all kinds of wonderful lore, and I've just scratched the surface of it. I'm already fascinated. So, I encourage people who are interested in these things not to sell, because it seems like all the people that are writing books are in the United States, right? I encourage people, not all the people, there are obviously some Canadian authors like Tom Steenberg and so forth that are writing about Sasquatch and such up here. Chris Rutkowski, I think is his name, writes about UFOs. But it seems like so much of the media is coming from the US. Look at your local folklore. You know, there's all kinds of things that could be of interest to you if you have an interest in high strangeness. Look at your old newspapers and those kinds of things. I really encourage people to get out there and explore because, Canada is a huge country and there's all kinds of interesting stuff to investigate if you're so inclined. So that's kind of my pitch.
It's a great idea for people to do. Like you say, a lot of it does come from the US side of things, and I think those
Mhm.
stories get told over and over, so they're
Over
redundant
and over.
sometimes. And that's why we're here at Haunting Live. We're trying to promote Canadian content, but also world content as well. So, but our focus is mostly on Canadian. So it's been great to have you on, Travis, to talk about some of the things that you do and have experience. So we thank you so much for bringing some of that Canadian content out.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Where can people find your books quickly?
So the books are from Beyond the Fray Publishing, and they are available on Amazon. You can get them as Kindle ebooks, of course. Get them in paperback. If you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, hey, they're free. So enjoy.
No, thank you again so much for coming on Haunting Life. We appreciate it, and hopefully have you back again for some more Canadian content on Sasquatch and other things.
I do hope so. I'm still in the exploratory phases for my next book, but doing some research now.
Well, thank you again, and welcome back anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Miss one of our episodes? Replay our episodes on Rhode Island Broadcasting, Wednesdays at 10 p.m. EST. Show your support for Haunting Live by supporting our broadcast partner, Rhode Island Broadcasting. Find them on YouTube. The paranormal can happen at any time, so that's why our Etsy store is always open. Get your paranormal items from cleansing to protection to attraction, all available now on our Etsy store. Search Haunting Live.